The 1971 Baltimore Colts, the real steel curtain. The 1971 Baltimore Colts defense was not just good, it was better than the 1976 Pittsburgh Steelers' so-called steel curtain defense. The defense that gets all the historical credit. While the Steelers are remembered as the gold standard of the 1970s, the Colts actually posted better overall defensive numbers and were far more consistent throughout the entire season. Pittsburgh had a rough 1-4 start, where their defense gave up an average of 22 points per game, while Baltimore never had a stretch like that. And this pattern held in the playoffs too. Each team played 2 playoff games and lost in the AFC Championship game, and both were defending Super Bowl champions. But the Baltimore Colts were much more consistent than the much-hyped steel curtain. In an era when defenses were judged by how they performed week in and week out, not just in the playoffs or Super Bowl, the 1971 Baltimore Colts defense stacks up as the more complete and dominant unit, the real steel curtain. So, let's start with the most basic and telling measure of a defense, total yards allowed. The 1971 Baltimore Colts defense held their opponents to just 2,852 total yards over the 14-game season, an average of just 204 yards per game. The 1976 Pittsburgh Steelers, on the other hand, allowed a total of 3,323 total yards, an average of 237 yards per game. Right from the start, the numbers show the Baltimore Colts defense was significantly more effective at limiting what the opposition could do. And here's some important context. The 1976 Pittsburgh Steelers offense was heading towards 5,000 total offensive yards, finishing with 4,637 yards, an average of 331 offensive yards per game. Meanwhile, the 1971 Baltimore Colts offense was much more modest, barely cracking 4,000 total offensive yards, with an average of roughly 286 offensive yards per game. So, the Baltimore Colts defense, in comparison to the 76 Steelers defense, was doing more with less help from their own offense, while the Steelers defense had a stronger offense to lean on. And watching those hard-hitting 1971 Colts defensive clips, you can see why they were so effective at limiting yards, but the ultimate measure of a defense is keeping points off of the board. So let's look at points per game. Looking at points per game, the 1971 Baltimore Colts were better. They held their opponents to an average of 10.0 points per game. The 1976 Pittsburgh Steelers allowed an average of 9.9 points per game, statistically equal. But when you look at the full picture, Baltimore was more consistent and more dominant week in and week out. Pittsburgh taking off for 5 games and giving up an average of 22 points per game doesn't exactly equate to being a steel curtain, much less the best defense ever. The Colts did have a 5-game stretch in the middle of the season, week 7 through week 11, where they gave up more than usual. But even then, it only averaged 16.4 points per game. Nowhere near the Steelers' early season struggles. The Steelers had the reputation, but the Colts were consistent and thus the better defense. Those defensive stands weren't just about stopping the run in the pass. The Baltimore Colts were all about creating chaos in the backfield and forcing turnovers. Looking at turnovers and sacks, the metrics clearly favor the Colts. The 1971 Baltimore Colts recorded 28 interceptions for 367 yards in returns and 1 touchdown from those interceptions, plus 26 fumble recoveries for 63 yards and another touchdown. That's 54 takeaways and 430 yards from those takeaways. The 1976 Pittsburgh Steelers had 22 interceptions for 262 yards and no touchdowns from those interceptions. Plus, they had 40 fumble recoveries for just 42 yards and 0 touchdown from those fumble recoveries. That's 62 takeaways and 304 yards from those takeaways. The Colts were down 8 in total turnovers, but they more than made up for it with what they did with the turnovers that they got. Gaining a football field plus 14 more yards and scoring 2 touchdowns off of them. And remember, the Colts offense was way worse in total yards than the Steelers offense. So the Colts defense was always doing more with less help from their own offense. In sacks, the 1971 Colts had 36 sacks, while the 1976 Steelers had 41 sacks. That's only a 5-sack difference over 14 games. Basically a wash. But given reality and not NFL hype, the 1971 Colts should be remembered as being every bit as menacing to quarterbacks as the so-called Steel Curtain. And now let's turn to playoff performance. Both teams lost in the AFC Championship game after winning their divisional round matchups. Let's compare their playoff performances side by side. In total yards allowed, the 1971 Colts gave up 451 yards compared to the 1976 Steelers' 390 yards. This is the only stat where the Steelers did better, but it was wiped out by the Colts being better in the stats that really matter. The Baltimore offense turned the ball over 6 times in the playoffs, putting great pressure on their defense by giving the opposition more possessions, while the Pittsburgh offense only turned the ball over twice. Steeler fans will point out that Franco Harris and Rocky Bleier were out for the AFC Championship. But the Colts were also missing their star running back, Norm Bulash. The combination of the Colts' offensive turnovers and Bulash being out equal the effect of Harris and Bleier being out for Pittsburgh. Also, in points per game, the Colts allowed 12 points per game, while the Steelers allowed 19 points per game, the Colts being a full touchdown better each game. The Colts forced 6 turnovers compared to the Steelers' mere 2. The Colts gave up fewer first downs, 27 for Pittsburgh, 24 for Baltimore. And both teams had 7 sacks. Moreover, the Colts almost had a shutout in the divisional round, while the Steelers never came close to a shutout in the 1976 playoffs. And keep in mind, the 1971 Colts faced the same Dolphins team that was in the midst of a still NFL record 27 straight home wins, and would go on to an undefeated season and back-to-back championships in 1972 and 1973. So, the Colts were more consistent and more opportunistic in the postseason as well. The Steelers had and have the reputation, but the 1971 Colts showed over and over again in the biggest games that they were the more complete defense. So, in conclusion, while the 1976 Steelers' so-called Steel Curtain has the legendary reputation, the numbers in the tape show that the 1971 Baltimore Colts defense was the better unit overall. They were more consistent, more opportunistic with turnovers, and more complete from week 1 to the end of the season. The goal of this channel is to celebrate the Baltimore Colts and to let Baltimore Ravens fans know of their glorious NFL heritage. This is your history. This is Baltimore's NFL history. And when you look at the numbers without the hype, the 1971 Baltimore Colts defense stands as one of the best defenses ever. The Baltimore Colts weren't just good. They were elite, arguably the best defense ever. So, who do you take, the 1971 Colts, the 76 Steelers, or maybe you like another defense? Please drop your take in the comments. If you enjoyed this, hit the like and subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.